The worst mistakes do not happen when you lose someone. They happen when you think they will always be there waiting. I did not know the exact moment my marriage ended. The judge signed the papers 6 months ago, but if I was honest, it had started long before that. Back then, I convinced myself that success required sacrifice. Long hours, missed dinners, canceled weekends. I told myself Hannah understood. I told myself she was strong enough to handle it. Most of all, I told myself there would always be more time. That Tuesday afternoon, Manhattan moved exactly the way it always did. Taxi horns echoed between glass towers. Thousands of people filled the sidewalks. Businessmen rushed through intersections while tourists paused to take photographs beneath towering buildings. The city never slowed down for anyone. Neither did I. I had just finished a meeting 3 blocks away and was heading toward another one. My phone buzzed constantly with messages. My driver waited across the street. Everything was normal. Then the traffic light changed. I stepped into the crosswalk with a crowd of strangers moving around me. Halfway across, I saw her. At first, my brain refused to accept it. The woman standing on the opposite corner looked familiar, but impossible. Hannah Parker. My ex-wife. The woman I had not seen since the divorce was finalized. For a moment, the noise of the city disappeared. The horns. The conversations, the footsteps, everything faded into silence. She wore a light beige coat despite the cool spring air. Her blonde hair rested against her shoulders exactly the way I remembered. But it was not her face that stopped me. It was her stomach. She was pregnant. Clearly pregnant. There was no mistaking it. My feet stopped moving. People brushed past me from both directions. Someone bumped my shoulder. Another person muttered an apology. I barely noticed. I could not take my eyes off her. Hannah stood near a coffee shop window holding a paper cup in both hands. She looked peaceful, healthy, different, not happier exactly, stronger, like someone who had rebuilt her life while I was too distracted to notice it happening. My chest tightened. The pedestrian signal began flashing. People hurried around me. A taxi horn blasted nearby. Still I stood frozen. My mind immediately searched for explanations. Maybe she had remarried. Maybe she had met someone else. 6 months was enough time. Was it not? The thought landed heavily in my stomach. I should have kept walking. I should have gone to my meeting. Instead, I remained there staring like a man who had forgotten where he was. Then Hannah looked up. Our eyes met across the street. Time seemed to stop again. Surprise flashed across her face first. Then something softer. Something unreadable. Neither of us smiled. Neither of us moved. We simply looked at each other while the city rushed around us. I realized then that I had spent 6 months convincing myself the divorce was behind me, that I had moved on, that she had become part of my past. But standing in that crosswalk, staring at the woman I once called my wife, I felt something I had not experienced in years. Regret. Pure, immediate, undeniable regret. And as my gaze drifted once more to the gentle curve of her stomach, a question entered my mind that would soon consume every waking thought. Who was the father of her baby? After that frozen moment in the crosswalk, I found myself walking aimlessly down the streets of Manhattan, the city moving past me in a blur. Horns honked, pedestrians chatted, and the aroma of street food filled the air. But my mind remained fixed on Hannah Parker and the unexpected news I had just absorbed. 6 months of separation, 6 months of convincing myself that our lives had diverged cleanly, yet here she was, not only alive in my thoughts but carrying the tangible proof of a life that might, or might not, be connected to me. Each step I took felt heavier, every sound amplified, the normal rhythm of the city now a background to my spiraling thoughts. I remembered our apartment, the quiet mornings we shared, the arguments we had, the compromises we never reached, and I wondered how different things could have been. How much of this moment was fate, how much was consequence of my own choices? I slowed at a small cafe tucked between 2 glass towers, the kind of place Hannah would have loved for its quiet charm. I stepped inside, hoping for a moment of clarity, and noticed a familiar coat hanging on the back of a chair by the window. My heart clenched. It was her. Hannah was seated, gently resting a hand on her stomach while reviewing some papers, completely absorbed yet radiating a calm strength that I had long overlooked. I stood near the entrance, unsure whether to approach or retreat, the air thick with tension and memory. She glanced up briefly, eyes meeting mine, a flicker of recognition passing over her face. There was no anger, no confrontation, only an acknowledgment of our shared past, and the invisible line that now separated our current lives. I approached slowly, every movement deliberate, wanting to respect her space yet feeling the undeniable pull that had always existed between us. "Hannah," I said softly, my voice betraying the mixture of shock, curiosity, and something deeper, a silent plea for understanding. She looked at me, expression neutral but measured, and simply nodded. "Ethan," she replied, her tone calm, carrying a quiet authority that immediately reminded me why I had loved her, why letting go had been the hardest decision of my life. We sat at a small table by the window, the bustle of the city now a distant hum, the morning light casting soft shadows over our faces. I studied her carefully, noticing the subtle curve of her belly, the small gestures she made while adjusting her scarf or sipping coffee, and realized how much life had moved forward without me. The thought was painful, sharp, and humbling. For the first time, I felt entirely vulnerable, stripped of all the control I usually commanded. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions, demand explanations, but instead, I let the silence stretch, allowing the gravity of the moment, the reality of what had changed, to sink in. And as she returned her gaze to the papers before her, I understood that this encounter was not merely about recognition or reunion. It was the beginning of a reckoning, a chance to confront the choices I had made, the time I had lost, and the possibility of redemption, however uncertain, that now lay quietly, irrevocably between us. The cafe around us felt like it existed in a different world, insulated from the rush and chaos of the city outside. Hannah Parker sat across from me, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows and casting soft highlights on her hair and the curve of her belly. I could not stop noticing the subtle strength in her posture, the calm determination in her gaze, and the way she moved with quiet grace. Every habitual motion, the way she adjusted her scarf or traced the edge of a paper with her finger, reminded me of the life that had continued in my absence, a life that I had once thought I controlled by removing myself from it. I wanted to speak, to ask everything at once, but the words lodged in my throat, thick and uncertain. Instead, I observed. I studied the details that had always been invisible to me, the faint creases of concentration on her forehead, the small ring she wore, the way her eyes flicked to the street as if imagining possibilities beyond the glass. Each observation stoked a mixture of longing and regret that I could not quell. In my mind, I replayed conversations we had before the separation, the words left unsaid, the promises broken silently under the weight of ambition and pride. The thought of the unborn child between us intensified that regret, introducing a gravity I had never anticipated. I thought about the mornings we had missed together, the quiet weekends we had sacrificed, and the laughter that once filled the rooms of our apartment, now silent and distant. The noise of the cafe faded further as I considered the passage of time, 6 months long enough for both healing and transformation, yet still insufficient for the mistakes I had made. Hannah did not speak, but her presence was a statement in itself. Composed, strong, untouchable in ways I could barely fathom. I noticed her eyes occasionally flick toward the entrance, as if expecting someone, as if testing my resolve to approach and remain present without overstepping boundaries. Each glance she offered carried subtle judgment and quiet measurement, a reminder that time had continued, and that the trust once implicit between us had to be rebuilt. I sipped my coffee, tasting more bitterness than warmth, and realized that my control over the situation was an illusion. I had no claim, no authority in this moment except for the attention she allowed me. And yet, the fact that she permitted me to share the same air, to sit across from her while the city moved outside, was a permission I had not expected and could scarcely comprehend. The sounds of the cafe, the clatter of cups, distant laughter, low hum of conversation, grounded me in reality, contrasting with the spiraling thoughts of the possibilities, the unknowns, and the future we had to navigate. Every second stretched, heavy with anticipation, with regret, and with the silent acknowledgment of what had been lost and what might still be regained. I knew that speaking prematurely could shatter the delicate balance we had arrived at. I also knew that waiting, listening, and observing could provide the insight necessary to navigate the complex emotional terrain laid out before me. And so I remained seated, letting the minutes unfold, aware that this morning, this quiet shared space, marked the beginning of a reckoning that would define not only my future with Hannah but the choices I would make as a man who had finally begun to understand the consequences of absence, pride, and the relentless march of time. After a few minutes of quiet observation, I finally found the courage to speak. "I did not expect to see you here," I said softly, careful not to startle Hannah Parker. She looked up, eyes meeting mine with a calm, measured expression that conveyed both acknowledgment and self-possession. The cafe around us continued its gentle hum of activity, the clinking of cups, quiet conversations, and the occasional laugh forming a soft backdrop to our conversation. I felt a strange mixture of relief and tension. Relief that she did not react with anger, tension because every word I spoke had weight, and every movement seemed loaded with unspoken history. "It has been some time," she replied, her tone neutral but firm, emphasizing the distance that had grown between us since the divorce. I nodded, feeling the familiar knot of regret tighten in my chest. "Yes, 6 months. Too long to realize what I might have lost," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. She studied me for a moment, her hand resting lightly on her stomach, and I could see the subtle curve that made my mind race with questions and fears. We exchanged pleasantries at first, cautious words testing the waters, but soon the conversation shifted to neutral topics: the city outside the window, the change of seasons, the small details of life we had both navigated alone. And yet beneath the surface, a current of tension and unresolved emotion ran through every sentence, every pause. I found myself watching her gestures, the way she sipped her coffee, the slight tilt of her head as she listened, and realizing how much had changed, not just in her life but in myself. The past seemed simultaneously distant and immediate, memories of our shared apartment, quiet mornings and missed opportunities pressing against the present reality of her pregnancy, her strength, and the undeniable shift in our dynamic. I wanted to reach across the table, to close the gap that life and choices had created, yet I restrained myself, knowing that trust and reconciliation required patience, observation, and careful attention. As the minutes passed, I realized the encounter was teaching me something crucial. Presence, humility, and acknowledgement of consequences are more powerful than any authority or wealth I once held. The weight of unspoken words hung between us, creating a delicate balance of expectation, curiosity, and restrained hope. Every glance, every subtle shift in expression carried meaning, and I understood that rebuilding any connection required more than apologies. It required listening, learning, and quietly proving that change was genuine. I took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of this moment, the mixture of fear and possibility, and recognized that this meeting, mundane in appearance yet extraordinary in emotion, was the beginning of a reckoning. One where I would confront the decisions I had made, the love I had lost, and the chance to redeem myself in the eyes of the woman who had shaped my life in ways I could never forget. When Hannah finally gathered her papers and prepared to leave, I felt an unexpected sense of urgency settle over me. Not panic, not desperation, something quieter. The realization that opportunities rarely announce themselves twice. She slipped the documents into her bag, adjusted her coat, and stood from the table with the same calm confidence that had followed her throughout the morning. For a brief moment I remembered another version of her. The woman who used to wait for me at dinner. The woman who would glance at the clock and tell herself I was only running a little late. The woman who always found a reason to believe tomorrow would be different. Standing in front of me now was not that woman. This Hannah had learned how to continue without me. The thought should have made me happy. Instead, it revealed just how much I had taken for granted. "It was good seeing you, Ethan," she said politely. Not warmly, not coldly, simply honestly. Somehow that hurt more than anger ever could. "You too," I replied. She nodded and turned toward the door. I watched her leave the cafe, disappearing into the flow of pedestrians outside, and for several seconds I remained frozen in my chair. Then I looked down at the untouched coffee sitting in front of me. Cold. Forgotten. Much like so many things in my marriage. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. 3 years earlier. A rainy Thursday evening. Hannah had made reservations at a restaurant overlooking the river. I remember promising I would be there by 7. I arrived after 10. She had waited the entire time. When I finally walked in, she smiled anyway. I had thanked her for understanding. Now, sitting alone in that cafe, I realized how wrong I had been. She had not been understanding. She had been lonely. Another memory followed. A weekend trip she had planned months in advance. I canceled the night before because of work. She said it was fine. I believed her. Looking back, I could see the disappointment hidden behind her smile. The pattern repeated itself over and over. Missed dinners. Unanswered calls. Conversations cut short because I was too busy. I always assumed there would be another chance. Another weekend. Another anniversary. Another year. The city outside continued moving while I sat there examining the wreckage of choices I had once defended. For years I had measured success in contracts, properties, and influence. Yet none of those things sat across from me at breakfast. None of them waited for me to come home. None of them had loved me enough to stay long after they should have left. The realization settled heavily in my chest. Hannah had not left because she stopped loving me. She left because I stopped showing her that she mattered. There was a difference. A painful difference. I eventually stood and walked outside into the cool spring air. Manhattan looked exactly the same as it had yesterday. Cars moved through intersections. People hurried toward meetings. The skyline stretched endlessly overhead. But everything felt different now. For the first time since the divorce, I stopped asking what Hannah had done after leaving me. Instead, I began asking a far more difficult question. What had I done to make leaving feel like her only choice? And as that question echoed through my mind, I realized the answer would change everything I thought I knew about our past, our marriage, and the future I suddenly wanted more than any empire I had ever built. For the next several days, I tried to return to normal. I attended meetings, signed documents, took calls, sat through presentations that would have once commanded my complete attention. None of it worked. Every conversation eventually led back to the same thought. Hannah Parker. More specifically, Hannah Parker and the child she was carrying. The question followed me everywhere. During morning meetings. Late at night in my penthouse. Even during the rare moments when the city fell quiet outside my windows. I told myself it was curiosity. Then I told myself it was concern. Eventually, I stopped lying to myself. It was hope. Dangerous, irrational hope. One evening, rain tapped softly against the glass walls of my office, while Manhattan glowed beneath a blanket of clouds. The city lights blurred against the wet windows, turning the skyline into a watercolor of gold and silver. I sat alone at my desk, staring at a calendar displayed on my computer screen. Dates. Nothing more than dates. Yet, my heart was beating faster than it had during negotiations worth millions of dollars. I began counting backward. The day of the divorce. The months before it. The final weeks of our marriage. My chest tightened. I counted again. More carefully this time. Then a third time. The numbers remained exactly the same. I leaned back in my chair, suddenly unable to focus on anything else. Hannah's pregnancy timeline matched a period before our divorce was finalized. Before she moved out. Before everything officially ended. The realization hit me with a force I was completely unprepared for. For several seconds, I simply stared at the city beyond the glass. Rain slid down the windows in slow trails. Somewhere below, thousands of people continued living their lives, unaware that my entire world had just shifted. I remembered one particular weekend near the end of our marriage. No meetings. No travel. No emergencies. Just two people trying, however briefly, to remember what it felt like to be together. Back then I had viewed it as an exception. A temporary pause before returning to business as usual. Now that memory carried a completely different weight. I stood and walked toward the window, pressing one hand against the cool glass. My reflection stared back at me. Tired. Older than I remembered. Suddenly, all the questions I had been asking transformed into one. Not who the father was, but whether I had spent 6 months grieving the loss of my marriage, while completely unaware that a part of my future might still be growing. The thought stole my breath. Yet alongside the shock came something else. Fear. Because if the child was mine, then I had already missed months I could never recover. Months Hannah had faced alone. Doctor appointments. Decisions. Uncertainty. Every realization exposed another consequence of my absence. I closed my eyes briefly. For years I had believed strength meant staying focused, staying detached, never allowing emotions to interfere with responsibility. Standing there in the quiet office, listening to rain strike the glass, I understood how wrong I had been. The strongest thing I could do now was face the truth, whatever that truth turned out to be. And for the first time since seeing Hannah in the crosswalk, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. Not demand answers, not make assumptions, simply ask the one person who deserved honesty more than anyone else. Hannah. The next afternoon, I found myself standing outside a small bookstore on the Upper West Side. It was not a place I would have visited before. In another life, I would have sent someone else to buy what I needed. But that version of me was the reason I had lost Hannah Parker in the first place. Through the large front window, I could see her moving slowly between shelves, one hand resting absent-mindedly against her stomach while the other traced the spines of books. Sunlight poured through the glass, filling the store with a warm golden glow. For several moments I remained outside watching quietly, not because I was afraid of seeing her, because I was afraid of what she might see when she looked at me. Eventually I stepped inside. The scent of paper and coffee immediately surrounded me. Hannah glanced up from a display table. Surprise flickered across her face before settling into cautious curiosity. Ethan. Hearing my name in her voice still affected me more than I wanted to admit. Hi. I stopped a respectful distance away. I hope I am not interrupting. She looked down at the book in her hands before shaking her head. No silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Just careful. Like two people learning a language they once spoke fluently but had forgotten over time. I took a slow breath. Can we talk? Her eyes searched mine for a moment. Then she nodded toward a quiet corner near the back of the store. We sat across from each other beside a tall window overlooking the street. Outside, people moved beneath bright spring skies while inside everything felt still. For once, I did not come prepared with arguments or explanations. I was tired of defending myself. I owe you an apology, I said. Hannah remained silent, listening, waiting. Not for one thing. For years of things. The words felt heavy but necessary. I spent so much time believing I was building a future for us that I never noticed I was abandoning the present. Her expression softened slightly, though she said nothing. Encouraged, I continued. I thought providing was enough. I thought success would make up for absence. I was wrong. For the first time, I allowed myself to fully acknowledge the truth. No excuses. No justifications. Just honesty. Hannah looked down briefly before returning her gaze to mine. Do you know what hurt the most? She asked quietly. I shook my head. You always promised things would get better later. Her voice remained calm, but every word landed with precision. Next month. Next year. After the next deal. After the next project. Everything important was always waiting for some future version of us. I lowered my eyes. Because she was right. Every single word. I know. The admission came easily now. Maybe because I had spent months avoiding it. And I am sorry. Another silence settled between us. Yet something felt different. Not fixed. Not healed. But honest. More honest than we had been in years. Then Hannah surprised me. You do seem different. My heart skipped. Do I? She nodded slowly. You are actually listening. The faintest smile touched her lips before disappearing again. It was a small moment. Tiny really. Yet somehow it meant more than any business victory I had ever achieved. Because for the first time since our marriage ended, Hannah was not looking at who I used to be. She was looking at who I was trying to become. And I silently promised myself that no matter what happened next, I would not waste that chance. The afternoon light filtered softly through the cafe windows, casting long golden streaks across the wooden floor, and the table where Hannah Parker and I sat. We had spent hours discussing logistics, appointments, and the tentative outlines of what the coming months might look like, but beneath the practical conversation, an unspoken current hummed between us. I watched her hands, delicate yet confident, resting gently on her stomach at times, and realized how much life had moved forward while I had been absorbed in my own world of deadlines and decisions. She spoke with calm authority about the tasks at hand, and I listened not just to her words but to the subtle confidence behind them. Each pause, each glance carried weight, signaling the careful balance she maintained between vulnerability and strength. I understood now that patience, observation, and respect were necessary if I hoped to rebuild any trust that had been broken. Outside, the city moved in its relentless rhythm, cars gliding through intersections, pedestrians weaving past one another, the occasional bicycle bell punctuating the ambient noise. Yet inside, time felt suspended, held together by the quiet determination emanating from Hannah. I felt a strange mixture of awe and humility, realizing that the woman I had once underestimated was entirely capable of navigating her own path without me. And yet she had allowed me into this shared space, into these moments where presence mattered more than words. I reflected on the months since our separation, the missed opportunities, the distractions, and the choices that had led to this point. Each recollection carried a subtle sting of regret, but also a recognition of the growth that both of us had achieved independently. As our discussion wound down, I noticed the soft curve of her smile as she responded to a mundane question, a small gesture that nevertheless conveyed trust, patience, and cautious hope. I knew that every action from this point forward, no matter how minor, would be measured and remembered. The challenge was not about winning her forgiveness with grand statements or declarations. It was about consistently demonstrating change, awareness, and genuine care. I promised myself silently that I would not squander this opportunity, that I would show through attentiveness, reliability, and quiet respect that I could be present in a way I had failed to be before. The sunlight continued to shift, highlighting the city outside, illuminating the fleeting moments of clarity, accountability, and connection forming across the table between us. It was not the conclusion of our story, but the beginning of a chapter defined by deliberate, thoughtful steps, and the recognition that redemption was earned gradually, in the unspoken, in the observant, in the attentive presence shared between two people navigating the fragile, promising terrain of a renewed relationship. The following morning, sunlight poured through the large windows of the apartment where Hannah Parker had agreed to meet me, illuminating the room in soft golden hues. The city below was awake, moving with its usual rhythm, but inside, everything felt suspended in anticipation. Hannah sat on the edge of the sofa, a blanket over her legs, her hands resting lightly on the curve of her belly. She looked calm, composed, and yet there was a depth in her eyes that spoke of months of strength, patience, and quiet endurance. I stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the sight, realizing that every past mistake, every moment of absence, had led me here, to this point where words alone could not convey the weight of what I felt. Slowly, I crossed the room and sat on the chair opposite her, careful to maintain the distance she seemed to need, yet close enough that our conversation would be intimate and undisturbed. I took a deep breath. "I want to understand," I said quietly, my voice steady, though my chest tightened with emotion. She looked at me, acknowledging my presence without speaking immediately. The silence was heavy but not oppressive. It carried the potential for connection, for reconciliation, for recognition of what had been lost, and what could yet be found. "I have had time to think," she finally said, her tone calm but deliberate, each word measured with care. Time to reflect on what I needed, what I wanted, and what I could no longer accept. I nodded slowly, letting the weight of her words sink in. "I know I have been absent. I know I have failed to see you when it mattered most." Her gaze softened slightly, though her expression remained composed, signaling that acknowledgment of the truth was the first step. I continued, "I want to be present now, in whatever way you allow me. I cannot change the past, but I want to be part of what comes next." The morning light shifted as she considered this, highlighting the subtle changes in her expression, the hint of cautious hope that perhaps she had not completely closed the door. Outside, the sounds of the city moved as always, but inside, time slowed. Every breath, every movement, every glance was amplified with significance. I realized that redemption was not a single declaration or gesture. It was consistent attention, sincere acknowledgment, and patient effort. And as she finally gave a small nod, the faintest acknowledgement of acceptance, I felt the first real possibility of rebuilding trust, of standing beside her and the child she carried, not as the man who had lost everything through absence and pride, but as someone willing to face the consequences, to learn to care, and to be truly present in the life that remained and the future we might now share together. In that quiet, sunlit room, I understood that the journey ahead would require more than words. It would require presence, patience, and unwavering commitment. And for the first time in months, I felt ready to take that first step.